The stallion's grave simply reads, "Murdered by cowards," a sentiment the Boggs family and eventually the courts agreed with.
The Indiana Massacre of 1973. Boggs clan butchered 22 deputies who shot their prize stallion. The bloodiest act of vengeance in Indiana history and the most devastating campaign of retribution the Southern Hill Country had ever witnessed from a family whose pride had been destroyed in a single act of senseless cruelty. This is the true story of the Boggs clan. Our story begins in the rugged hill country of Crawford County, Indiana, in the shadow of the Hoosier National Forest, known throughout the region as one of the most isolated and fiercely independent corners of the state. The hills rise here in ancient folds of limestone and hardwood forest, their hollows sheltering families who had carved lives from wilderness and who had defended those lives against all who threatened them. The people who settled these hills came seeking freedom from interference, and their descendants maintained that spirit through generations of conflict with authorities who never understood that these ridges had their own laws, their own justice, their own ways of handling matters that outsiders had no business involving themselves in. You see, in Crawford County in 1973, the bonds of family were sacred above all else, but the bond between a clan and its heritage was something more, something that the Hill people recognized as touching the very core of identity itself. A family that had bred horses for generations, that had poured their knowledge and their love into bloodlines that stretched back before the Civil War. That family saw in their animals not mere property, but living connections to ancestors who had passed the tradition from father to son for over a century. To harm such an animal was to commit an act of desecration as well as destruction. The conflict between local law enforcement and the hill communities had been simmering for years by the time our story begins. The sheriff's department had been expanding its reach into areas that had governed themselves for generations, enforcing regulations that the hill people viewed as intrusions into their traditional way of life. The deputies who enforced these new rules often came from the towns, men who viewed the Hill families with contempt and who saw in their isolation an excuse for harassment that would never have been tolerated in more visible communities. The family who would become known throughout Indiana simply as the Boggs clan had lived in the hollows of Crawford County for 5 generations, since Ezekiel Boggs had claimed land along the Blue River in the years before Indiana achieved statehood. They were a large family, spread across multiple homesteads that dotted the ridges and valleys of the Southern Hill Country, connected by blood and marriage and the fierce loyalty that characterized all the old clans. The horse breeding tradition that defined them had begun with Ezekiel himself, who had brought a Tennessee Walker mare with him from Virginia and had begun the bloodline that would become the family's greatest pride. That's right, the Boggs family had been breeding horses for over 150 years by the time of our story, had developed a reputation throughout the region for producing animals of exceptional quality. Their horses were known for their spirit and their endurance, their intelligence and their beauty, characteristics that had been carefully cultivated through generations of selective breeding. The knowledge of how to maintain and improve the bloodline had been passed from father to son, from mother to daughter, becoming part of the family identity in ways that outsiders could not understand. The patriarch of the clan in 1973 was a man named Elijah Boggs, 62 years old, his hair gone white, his face weathered by decades of outdoor work, his eyes still holding the sharpness that his father and grandfather had possessed before him. He was the 7th generation of Boggs men to breed horses in Crawford County, had inherited both the land and the knowledge that made their operation possible. The respect he commanded within the family was absolute, earned through decades of wisdom and fairness in all his dealings. Elijah had 4 sons and 3 daughters, all grown and married, all living on family land within a few miles of the main homestead. His sons had sons of their own, young men who were learning the family trade, who would carry the tradition forward into the next generation. The extended clan numbered over 40 people when everyone gathered, a network of kinship that provided both support and protection in a world that had never been entirely welcoming. The horse that would become the center of our story was a stallion named Sovereign, the finest animal the Boggs family had ever produced. Sovereign was a Tennessee walking horse of exceptional breeding, his bloodline traceable through 7 generations of Boggs horses back to that original mare Ezekiel had brought from Virginia. He stood 16 hands high, His coat a deep chestnut that gleamed like copper in sunlight, his mane and tail black as midnight, his eyes showing the intelligence that had made the Boggs horses famous throughout the region. The breeding program that had produced Sovereign represented knowledge that could not be written down, understanding that passed from generation to generation through observation and experience. Each mating decision reflected calculations about temperament and conformation, about the subtle qualities that distinguished exceptional animals from merely good ones. The Boggs family had made thousands of such decisions over 150 years, each one building on the lessons of previous generations, each one moving the bloodline closer to the ideal they carried in their minds. Sovereign's dam had been a mare named Lady Grace, herself the product of 6 generations of careful breeding, an animal of such quality that the family had refused offers that would have made them wealthy by any ordinary standard. His sire had been a stallion named Majesty, acquired from a Tennessee breeder after years of negotiation, an animal whose bloodline complemented Lady Grace's in ways that only experts could appreciate. The mating had been planned for years before it occurred, the family understanding that the combination might produce something extraordinary. And Sovereign had exceeded even their highest expectations. From his first days as a foal, he had displayed the qualities that the Boggs family had been breeding toward for over a century. His gait was perfect, the smooth, gliding walk that gave the Tennessee walking horse its name flowing from him as naturally as breathing. His temperament combined spirit with tractability, fire with gentleness, the rare balance that made an animal both impressive and manageable. As he matured, Sovereign had become everything the family had hoped and more. His offspring inherited his qualities with remarkable consistency, foals that showed from their earliest days the characteristics that had taken 7 generations to cultivate. The breeding future of the Boggs horses was secured in Sovereign's genetics, the foundation upon which the next 150 years would be built. That's right. Sovereign was not merely a horse, but a living monument to everything the Boggs family had achieved over 150 years of careful breeding. He represented the culmination of their knowledge, the proof of their expertise, the promise of future generations of exceptional animals. His offspring were already showing the qualities that would continue the line, foals that carried his bloodline, and that would produce their own offspring in turn. To understand what Sovereign meant to the Boggs clan was to understand what a cathedral means to a faith, what a crown jewel means to a dynasty. The market value of Sovereign was estimated at over $50,000, an enormous sum in 1973. But the family had refused every offer to purchase him regardless of the price. Money could not replace what he represented, the physical embodiment of their heritage, the living connection to ancestors who had built the bloodline generation by generation, the foundation upon which all future Boggs horses would be built. Sovereign was beyond price because he was beyond mere property. Now, to understand what happened in the spring of 1973, you need to understand the particular circumstances that had made the Boggs family targets for the county sheriff's attention. A new sheriff had been elected in Crawford County, a man named Vernon Sloan, who had campaigned on a platform of modernizing the county and bringing the Hill families under control. Sloan was 45 years old, a former state trooper who viewed the traditional independence of the Hill people as an affront to his authority. Sheriff Sloan had heard complaints from developers who wanted to purchase hill country land for vacation homes and recreational properties. The Boggs family owned some of the most desirable acreage in the county, land that bordered the national forest and that commanded views that wealthy outsiders were willing to pay premium prices to acquire. The family had refused all offers, had made clear that their land was not for sale at any price, had continued to live as their ancestors had lived, while the modern world encroached from every direction. The sheriff saw in this refusal not the exercise of property rights, but defiance of progress, resistance to the economic development that he believed would benefit the county. He began looking for ways to pressure the Boggs family, to create problems that might make them more amenable to selling, to demonstrate that their traditional isolation could not protect them from modern authority. He assembled a force of deputies who shared his contempt for the Hill families, men who viewed the Boggs clan as obstacles to progress, as relics of a past that should have been swept away long ago. 22 deputies would ultimately participate in what happened, men whose names would become synonymous with the brutality that followed. And that's when the nightmare began to unfold. You see, the morning of April 15, 1973, had started like any other spring day on the Boggs homestead. Elijah had risen early to check on the horses, had walked among the animals he had known since their birth, had spent time with Sovereign as he did every morning. The stallion had greeted him with the recognition that comes from years of relationship, had accepted the apple that Elijah always brought, had stood patiently while the old man checked his condition. The sound of vehicles announced the arrival of trouble shortly after dawn. A convoy of sheriff's department vehicles came up the long drive that led to the main homestead, more vehicles than Elijah had ever seen the department deploy at once. 22 armed deputies emerged from the cars and trucks, their weapons visible, their manner suggesting that they had come for confrontation rather than conversation. Sheriff Sloan approached Elijah with a document he claimed was a warrant authorizing the search of all Boggs properties for evidence of illegal activities. The warrant was based on anonymous tips that the family was involved in drug trafficking, allegations that were completely false, but that provided the legal pretext Sloan needed to enter their land. Elijah knew the accusations were fabricated, knew that the real purpose of the raid was harassment and intimidation, but he also knew that resistance would only make things worse. The search that followed was systematic destruction disguised as law enforcement. Deputies entered every building on the property, overturned furniture and scattered belongings, damaged equipment, and broke objects that had been in the family for generations. They found no evidence of drug activity because there was none to find, but the absence of evidence did not deter them from continuing their rampage. What happened next would be remembered in Crawford County for generations as the most senseless act of cruelty ever committed by local law enforcement, a moment of casual brutality that demonstrated everything the Hill people had always known about how outsiders viewed them. A deputy named James Lawson had wandered to the horse barn during the search, had encountered Sovereign in his stall, had been startled when the stallion, disturbed by the commotion throughout the property, had reared and struck the stall door with his hooves. Lawson, who knew nothing about horses and feared them, responded by drawing his service weapon and shooting Sovereign 3 times in the chest. The shots echoed across the hollow, bringing everyone running to see what had happened. They found Sovereign collapsed in his stall, blood pooling beneath his magnificent body, his eyes still open but already glazing over with approaching death. The stallion that had taken 7 generations to produce, the culmination of 150 years of careful breeding, the living heart of the Boggs family heritage, was dying on the floor of his own barn, while the deputy who had shot him stood watching without apparent concern. Elijah reached Sovereign before anyone else, fell to his knees beside the horse, cradled the great head in his lap as the animal took its final breaths. The old man's face was a mask of grief and rage, his hands stroking the mane he had brushed 1,000 times, his voice murmuring words that no one else could hear. Sovereign died in Elijah's arms, his eyes fixed on the face of the man who had loved him, the bond between them unbroken even at the moment of death. The official report filed by Sheriff Sloan claimed that the shooting had been necessary, that the horse had attacked Deputy Lawson, and that lethal force had been the only option to prevent injury. The report made no mention of the fact that Sovereign had been secured in his stall, that he had posed no actual threat to anyone, that the shooting had been an act of panic and ignorance rather than self-defense. No charges were filed against Lawson. No compensation was offered for the animal. No acknowledgement was made that anything wrong had occurred. But for the Boggs clan, the matter had only begun. You see, the death of Sovereign destroyed something in the Boggs family that could never be repaired. The stallion had been more than property, more than livestock, more than even a beloved animal. He had been the living embodiment of their heritage, the proof that their way of life had value, the connection to ancestors who had built something beautiful over generations. His death at the hands of a deputy who neither understood nor cared what he was destroying was an assault on everything the family believed about themselves. The grief that consumed the clan in the days following Sovereign's death was unlike anything they had experienced, deeper than the loss of any individual family member, because it encompassed the loss of something that belonged to all of them. They buried Sovereign on the ridge above the homestead, dug the grave themselves because they could not bear to have anyone else touch his body, marked the site with a stone that bore only his name, and the years of his birth and death. And as the family gathered at that grave, united in their grief and their rage, a decision was made that would define everything that followed. They would kill them. Every deputy who had participated in the raid, every man who had searched and destroyed and stood watching while Sovereign died, every officer who had been part of the force that had invaded their land and murdered their heritage. The clan would hunt them one by one, would find them wherever they went, would ensure that each understood why he was dying before the end came. 22 deputies had come to their property that morning. 22 deputies would die before the Boggs clan was finished. And that vow, made in the silence of a hilltop grave, would be fulfilled in ways that no one could have imagined. The planning process took 3 weeks, during which the clan gathered information while appearing to be consumed by grief. The appearance was not entirely false. The grief was real and overwhelming, present in every moment of every day. But beneath the grief was something harder, something that the isolation of the hills had preserved in families like the Boggs, something that modern society had forgotten, but that these people had never lost. The clan operated as a unit in ways that law enforcement could not comprehend. There were over 40 adults who could participate in operations, people who knew the land intimately, who could move through the forests and hollows without being seen, who had skills of hunting and tracking that had been passed down through generations. The deputies they were hunting were soft men from towns, men who did not understand the terrain they had entered when they raided the Boggs property, men who were vulnerable in ways they could not imagine. The first killing came 3 weeks after Sovereign's death. The target was Deputy James Lawson himself, the man who had pulled the trigger, whose bullets had ended 150 years of careful breeding in a moment of panic and ignorance. Lawson was found in his home, dead from injuries that suggested he had been trampled by a horse, his body bearing the marks of hooves that had struck him repeatedly. The message was unmistakable. The killer had ensured that Lawson experienced something of what Sovereign had experienced, had delivered death in a form that echoed the crime being avenged. The killing of James Lawson sent shockwaves through the sheriff's department. The manner of death, the obvious connection to the horse that Lawson had killed, made clear that this was not random violence, but targeted revenge. The deputies who had participated in the raid understood immediately that they were being hunted, that someone was seeking retribution for what had happened at the Boggs homestead. Fear began to spread through their ranks. The second killing came 10 days later, targeting another deputy who had participated in the raid. This man, named Robert Mitchell, had been one of those who had stood watching while Sovereign died, had laughed at the old man kneeling in his horse's blood, had made comments about how the hill people cared more about their animals than normal folks did. Mitchell was found dead in circumstances that also suggested horse-related trauma, his body bearing wounds consistent with being kicked and trampled. The third and fourth killings came in quick succession, demonstrating that the campaign was accelerating. Both victims were deputies from the Sloan force, both killed in circumstances that maintained the equine theme of the first 2 deaths. The sheriff's department began to realize that they faced something unprecedented, a coordinated campaign of vengeance that was systematically eliminating everyone who had participated in the Boggs raid. That's right. The Boggs clan continued their campaign through the spring and summer of 1973, striking with a precision that kept their enemies constantly off balance. The 5th deputy died in late May, found on a rural road where he had apparently been thrown from a horse that had then trampled him, though no one could explain how a town deputy had come to be riding in such an isolated location. The circumstances suggested that he had been forced onto the horse, that his death had been staged to deliver a message that everyone would understand. The 6th was discovered shortly after, killed in similar circumstances on the opposite side of the county. The 7th and 8th deaths came on the same night, in different locations miles apart, demonstrating that the clan was operating multiple teams simultaneously. The coordination required to execute such attacks suggested planning and resources that the sheriff's department had not anticipated, an enemy that was organized and patient and absolutely committed to its purpose. The deputies who remained understood that they faced something far beyond ordinary criminal violence, a family that operated with military precision and that possessed intelligence about their movements that seemed almost supernatural. The state police were called in after the 8th killing, bringing resources and expertise that the county department lacked. But even with reinforcements, the investigation made no progress. The Boggs clan had connections throughout the hill country, networks of family and friendship that extended for miles in every direction. Every attempt to gather intelligence was met with silence. Every lead ended in dead ends. Every surveillance operation was compromised before it could produce results. The psychological impact on the surviving deputies was devastating. Men who had participated in the raid now examined every shadow, jumped at every sound, saw in every stranger a potential member of the Boggs clan come to claim their life. Some developed symptoms that would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress, unable to sleep or eat, unable to function in their daily lives. Others resigned their positions, hoping that leaving law enforcement might save them, not understanding that the clan made no distinctions between active and former deputies. The terror that began to spread through the remaining deputies was unlike anything Crawford County had experienced. This was not ordinary rural violence, not the straightforward danger of criminals who might shoot at officers during arrests. This was something else entirely, a systematic campaign by people who knew the land better than law enforcement ever could, who could strike without warning and disappear without trace, who seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. Each killing was executed with care that reflected the clan's intimate knowledge of the terrain and their patience as hunters who had tracked game through these forests for generations. They followed their prey for days before striking, learned their habits and their vulnerabilities, waited for the perfect moment when the target would be alone and undefended. The skills that had made their ancestors successful hunters were now applied to a different kind of prey. The investigation into the killings struggled against an enemy it could not comprehend. State police were brought in to assist, but they fared no better than the local department. The Boggs clan had lived in these hills for 5 generations, knew every path and hollow, every hiding place and escape route. They could move through the forest without leaving traces that even experienced trackers could follow, could approach targets without being detected, could strike and vanish before anyone knew what had happened. The 9th killing came as summer reached its peak, targeting one of the deputies who had fled to a neighboring county seeking safety and distance. The Boggs clan tracked him there, waited for the opportunity that patience always provided, killed him in a manner consistent with the previous deaths. The message was clear. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, no safety anywhere for men who had participated in Sovereign's death. The 10th and 11th killings followed in quick succession, each victim found with injuries suggesting horse-related trauma. The investigation had by this point essentially collapsed, the resources devoted to it producing nothing but dead ends and frustrated investigators. The Boggs clan operated with impunity, protected by a community that viewed them as heroes rather than criminals. The 12th came in late summer, the 13th shortly after. The pattern was relentless, the pace steady, the determination absolute. The Boggs clan was not merely killing men, but delivering a message that everyone in the region understood. What had been done to Sovereign would be repaid in kind, measured out one death at a time until the debt was fully paid. The 14th deputy died on October 15, 1973, exactly 6 months after Sovereign's death. The anniversary timing was deliberate, a reminder that the clan remembered every detail of what had been done and would continue until the account was balanced. The remaining deputies understood that time was not on their side, that each passing month brought new deaths and diminished hope of survival. The federal involvement that some had hoped would turn the tide never materialized in meaningful form. Federal agencies sent investigators who gathered information and returned to their offices, wrote reports that acknowledged the difficulty of the case, recommended that resources be focused elsewhere. The Boggs clan had committed their crimes in a jurisdiction perfectly suited to their talents, a place where their knowledge of the terrain and their community support made them essentially untouchable. The 15th and 16th killings came as autumn turned to winter, the changing seasons doing nothing to slow the campaign. The 17th death occurred just before Christmas, a particularly cruel timing that left a family grieving during what should have been a season of celebration. Some later speculated that the timing was deliberate, that the Boggs clan had chosen to strike, when it would cause maximum emotional damage, but others believed it was simply coincidence, the clan taking opportunities as they arose. The 18th and 19th killings followed in January and February, the winter weather providing cover for attackers who knew how to move through snow without leaving obvious trails. The tracking skills that had made the Boggs men successful hunters now served a deadlier purpose, allowing them to approach their prey in conditions that should have provided warning. The deputies who remained had effectively stopped living normal lives, hiding in protected locations, refusing to venture out alone, counting the days until their turn came. The 20th deputy died in March, leaving only Sheriff Sloan himself and his chief deputy still alive from the original force of 22. Both men had barricaded themselves in protected locations, had requested state and federal assistance, had effectively abandoned their duties in favor of mere survival. The sheriff who had set out to bring the Hill families under control now spent his days hiding from the consequences of his arrogance. The 21st killing came in early April, targeting the chief deputy who had been at Sloan's side throughout the original raid, who had stood watching while Sovereign died without offering any objection. He was found on the road between the county seat and his fortified home, his vehicle run off the road, his body bearing the marks of the same horse-related trauma that had claimed his colleagues. The method had remained consistent throughout the campaign, each death echoing the death that had started everything. And then came the night when Sheriff Vernon Sloan himself died. The 22nd and final killing in a campaign that had lasted exactly 1 year. On April 15, 1974, the anniversary of Sovereign's death, Sloan was found in the ruins of his own home, which had burned to the ground during the night. His body had been trampled before the fire, bearing the same wounds that had marked his deputies, the equine signature that the Boggs clan had maintained throughout their campaign of vengeance. The fire had destroyed whatever evidence might have remained, but no one who understood the situation doubted what had happened. The sheriff who had ordered the raid that killed Sovereign had paid with his life, the last of 22 men, to fall before the Boggs clan's determination. The debt had been paid in full, measured out over exactly 1 year, 1 death for each man who had participated in the crime. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the killing stopped. No member of the Boggs clan was ever arrested for the 22 deaths, never tried, never officially connected to the campaign that had eliminated an entire sheriff's department over the course of a year. The evidence that might have convicted them was never found. The witnesses who might have testified were either dead or unwilling to speak. The community that had protected them maintained its silence even after the campaign ended. The state investigation that followed the killings struggled to build cases that could survive in court. Everyone knew who was responsible, but knowing and proving were different things entirely. The Boggs clan had been careful, had left no evidence that could definitively connect them to any of the deaths, had maintained a discipline that modern criminals rarely achieved. One by one, the investigations were closed without charges, the cases filed away as unsolved, the official record reflecting nothing of what everyone knew to be true. But everyone knew. The Hill people knew, the state police knew, the families of the dead deputies knew. They understood what had happened and why, understood that 22 men had paid with their lives for the crime of killing a horse that represented 150 years of family heritage, understood that the Boggs clan had extracted a justice that the official system would never have provided. The Boggs clan continued to live in Crawford County for decades after the killings ended, continued to breed horses as their ancestors had done, continued to maintain the traditions that had defined them for generations. They never spoke of what they had done during that year of vengeance, never acknowledged their role in the deaths that had reshaped the county's law enforcement, never showed any sign of guilt or regret for the campaign they had conducted. Elijah Boggs lived for another 15 years after the final killing, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1989 at the age of 78. He was buried on the ridge beside Sovereign, the man and the horse reunited in death, their graves marked by simple stones that bore only names and dates. The family gathered for his funeral as they had gathered for the Stallion's burial, united in their grief as they had been united in their vengeance. The bloodline that Sovereign had represented continued through his offspring, the foals and fillies he had sired before his death, carrying his genetics into future generations. The Boggs family never produced another horse quite like Sovereign, never recaptured the perfection that had taken 7 generations to achieve, but they continued the tradition that their ancestors had established, continued to breed animals that carried traces of that original bloodline. The aftermath of the Boggs clan's campaign reshaped law enforcement in Crawford County for a generation. No sheriff who served in the decades that followed ever attempted to confront the Hill families as Sloan had done, understanding that there were limits to what could be done without consequences, that the isolation of the Hills protected traditions that modern authority could not easily suppress. The state investigation that followed the campaign became a case study in the limits of law enforcement against cohesive rural communities. Investigators documented their frustrations in reports that were later made public, describing witnesses who refused to speak, evidence that disappeared, informants who provided false information. The Boggs clan had not merely killed 22 deputies, but had demonstrated the powerlessness of official authority against a community that chose not to cooperate. The reforms that followed were informal, but real. Deputies learned to treat the Hill families with a respect that had been absent during Sloan's tenure, understood that harassment and brutality could provoke responses that no amount of force could counter. The balance of power that had existed before Sloan's election was restored, an unspoken understanding that the Hill people would be left to govern themselves as they always had. The development pressures that had motivated Sloan's campaign did not disappear entirely, but they were directed elsewhere, toward communities that did not have the Boggs clan's reputation for defending their land by any means necessary. The vacation homes and recreational properties were built in other counties, on land whose owners were willing to sell, leaving Crawford County's hill country largely unchanged. The Boggs family's victory was measured not just in the deaths of 22 deputies, but in the preservation of a way of life that had survived for 5 generations. Federal authorities considered involvement at various points during the campaign, but ultimately declined to pursue charges. The evidentiary problems that had stymied state investigators would have been equally challenging at the federal level, and the political calculus did not favor a lengthy prosecution that might ultimately fail. The decision to leave the matter to state authorities was pragmatic rather than principled, but it effectively ended any hope of official accountability for the killings. The media coverage of the campaign evolved over the course of the year, from initial horror at the mounting death toll to something approaching sympathy for a family that had lost its heritage to official violence. Journalists who traveled to Crawford County, expecting to find ignorant hillbillies instead, encountered a sophisticated community that had preserved traditions the modern world had forgotten, that understood their land and their animals in ways that urbanized Americans could barely comprehend. The narrative shifted from law enforcement victims to community defense, from criminal violence to justified vengeance. The cultural impact extended beyond Crawford County. The Boggs clan's campaign became a story told throughout southern Indiana and beyond, a reminder of what could happen when outsiders pushed too hard against communities that had their own ways of handling matters. The story was passed from generation to generation, modified and embellished as it traveled, becoming part of the folklore of a region that had always valued independence above all else. The grave site where Elijah and Sovereign rest together became a place of quiet pilgrimage for those who knew the story, visited by family members and admirers, who wanted to pay respects to a man and a horse whose bond had been strong enough to survive death, whose memory had been defended with a ferocity that the modern world could barely comprehend. The stones stand together on the ridge, overlooking the land that the Boggs family had held for 5 generations, a testament to loyalty that transcended the boundaries between human and animal. The songs that emerged from the Boggs clan story varied widely in their approach and message. Some were straightforward ballads that recounted the events in chronological order, from Sovereign's death through the campaign to the final killing. These songs celebrated the clan's determination, described their revenge in terms that bordered on admiration, portrayed them as defenders of a heritage that had been violated by men who neither understood nor respected it. The first songs appeared within months of the campaign's conclusion, composed by local musicians who understood the power of the narrative. These early ballads spread through southern Indiana and beyond, learned by one community and carried to the next, modified and embellished as they traveled. The songs served multiple purposes: entertainment, moral instruction, and preservation of a history that official records treated only as unsolved crimes. One popular ballad described Sovereign himself, painting a portrait of an animal who represented everything beautiful about the tradition his family had maintained. The song captured his beauty and his spirit, the generations of careful breeding that had produced him, the bond between him and Elijah that had grown over years of daily interaction. It portrayed his death in terms that made the tragedy visceral, the shots echoing across the hollow, the blood pooling beneath his body, the old man kneeling in the stall with his dying horse. The melody was haunting and memorable, built on traditional patterns that made it easy to learn and hard to forget. Musicians reported that audiences would fall silent during certain verses, that the image of Elijah holding his dying horse touched something deep in people who had never owned a horse and never would. The song created a heaviness in the air that lingered long after the final note had faded. The verses describing Sovereign's death became iconic, repeated in countless retellings. They captured Deputy Lawson's ignorance and fear, his panic at an animal he did not understand, his decision to shoot rather than simply step back from the stall. They described Elijah's grief as he held Sovereign's head, the tears that fell on the horse's mane, the words that no one else could hear. The image became a symbol of what happened when those who did not understand the old ways were given power over those who did. Another song told the story from the deputies' perspective, describing their growing terror as their colleagues died one by one around them, each killed in a manner that echoed what they had done to Sovereign. This song was darker than most, capturing the psychological horror of enemies who struck without being seen, who left bodies marked with wounds that spoke of hooves and trampling. It described their attempts to flee, their efforts to hide, their final understanding that the Boggs clan would find them regardless. The song imagined their final moments, the understanding that came too late, that what they had participated in was monstrous, the regret that served no purpose when death was already upon them. It offered no sympathy for these men, but rather held them up as examples of what happened when ignorance and power combined, when those who did not respect tradition were given authority over those who maintained it. A third song focused on the clan itself, on the family that had lived in the Crawford County hills for 5 generations, whose traditions had been violated by men who saw only backwardness where there was actually deep knowledge and skill. This song celebrated the unity of the Boggs family, their ability to operate as a single entity despite numbering over 40 people, their determination to defend their heritage against all who would threaten it. A fourth song addressed the broader meaning of the events, connecting the Boggs clan's campaign to traditions of rural resistance that stretched back through American history. This song was more philosophical than the others, exploring questions about progress and tradition, about who had the right to decide how people should live their lives, about the costs of modernization that its advocates refused to acknowledge. The most famous of all the Boggs clan songs was composed several years after the events by a professional musician who traveled to Crawford County to research the story firsthand. This comprehensive ballad told the complete narrative with skill and emotional power, becoming a standard in the folk music repertoire. It has been recorded by numerous artists over the years, carrying the Boggs story to audiences who never knew them, but who recognized in their actions something universal about family and defense and the bonds between humans and the animals they love. Historians who have studied the Boggs clan case have reached varying conclusions about its significance and meaning. Some have analyzed it as an example of resistance to modernization, arguing that the sheriff's campaign represented broader forces that were threatening traditional communities throughout rural America. They note that Sloan's real goal had been to make the Boggs land available for development, that Sovereign's death was not merely cruelty, but a calculated assault on the family's will to remain. These scholars have traced the connections between the Boggs case and similar conflicts throughout Appalachia and the rural Midwest during the 1970s. The decade saw unprecedented pressure on traditional communities from developers, speculators, and government agencies that viewed rural land as resources to be exploited rather than homes to be respected. The Boggs clan's response, while extreme, reflected frustrations that many rural families shared but few were willing to act upon. The economic analysis reveals how development pressure motivated the sheriff's actions. The land owned by the Boggs family had been valued at over $2 million by developers who wanted to build vacation homes overlooking the national forest. Sloan had personal financial interests in those development plans, connections to investors who would have profited enormously if the Boggs family could have been persuaded or forced to sell. The raid that killed Sovereign was part of a campaign of harassment designed to make remaining untenable. Others have focused on the particular bond between humans and horses that the case illustrated, examining how animals could become repositories of family identity and heritage. Sovereign was not merely a valuable animal, but a living connection to ancestors who had built the bloodline over 150 years, a tangible link to a past that might otherwise have faded from memory. His death severed that link in ways that mere property destruction could not have achieved. Animal behavior researchers have analyzed the methods used in the killings, the consistent use of horse-related trauma to dispatch the deputies. The Boggs clan understood horses in ways that their victims could not have comprehended, knew how to stage scenes that suggested accidents or attacks by animals. Their knowledge of equine behavior allowed them to deliver deaths that carried symbolic weight while appearing to investigators as something other than deliberate murder. The psychological analysis has examined how the clan's response reflected the values of their community, the importance placed on honor and revenge in cultures that had maintained their isolation from modern norms. The Boggs family did not see themselves as murderers, but as defenders of their heritage, as people who were doing what anyone in their position would have done if they had the means and the will. Sociologists have studied the community response to the killings, the wall of silence that prevented any successful prosecution. The Hill people of Crawford County demonstrated a solidarity that transcended individual family connections, united in their opposition to outside authority that had demonstrated its contempt for their traditions. The Boggs clan could not have sustained their campaign for a year without the active support of neighbors who shared their values and their grievances. Legal scholars have noted the impossibility of prosecuting a case against an entire clan, the ways in which large family networks can provide mutual protection that individual criminals cannot achieve. The Boggs clan's discipline in maintaining silence, their ability to coordinate complex operations without leaving evidence, their willingness to protect each other regardless of legal consequences, all of these demonstrated the strength of family bonds that modern society often dismisses. You see, what the Boggs clan did cannot be justified by any conventional legal or moral framework. They killed 22 men, each one executed in a manner designed to echo the death that had started everything. Each death planned and carried out with determination that allowed no mercy. The fact that their victims had participated in Sovereign's death does not eliminate the fact that they acted as judge, jury, and executioner, taking lives that were not theirs to take. The moral calculus of their actions has been debated by ethicists and philosophers since the story became widely known. Some argue that the systematic destruction of their heritage created circumstances in which normal moral rules no longer applied, that those who attack the foundation of a family's identity forfeit their own claim to protection. Others counter that no property, however valuable or symbolic, can justify the taking of human life. The question of proportionality has been particularly contested. One horse, however magnificent, was the immediate cause of 22 deaths. To those who view animals as property, the response seems wildly disproportionate, a massacre triggered by what should have been a civil matter, resolved through lawsuits and insurance claims. To those who understand what Sovereign represented, the proportionality shifts. 150 years of heritage, the living connection to generations of ancestors, was not property but identity itself. The families of the deputies killed present another dimension of the moral complexity. These men had wives and children, parents and siblings, people who grieved their deaths regardless of what they had done. Some of these family members have spoken publicly about their losses, described the terror of that year when their loved ones were being hunted, expressed anger at a system that failed to protect or avenge them. Their grief is real, their losses genuine. Their voice is a reminder that the Boggs clan's vengeance created victims beyond those directly responsible for Sovereign's death. The distinction between the deputies themselves has also been raised. Not all 22 men played equal roles in what happened. Some participated actively in the destruction of property, while others merely stood by. Some laughed at Elijah's grief, while others were troubled by what they witnessed. Did all of them deserve to die? Did the Boggs clan make distinctions, or did mere presence at the raid condemn everyone equally? These questions have no easy answers. The hill communities that protected the Boggs clan made their own judgment, decided that what the clan did was justice rather than murder, refused to cooperate with investigations that might have brought them to trial. Their silence was their verdict, their protection, their endorsement of actions that the official world could only condemn. And yet their story cannot be simply condemned, reduced to a tale of criminality that teaches only the obvious lesson that murder is wrong. They were a family whose heritage had been destroyed by men who neither understood nor cared what they were destroying, whose legal remedies had been blocked by a system that protected the killers, whose way of life was under assault from forces that wanted their land and saw their traditions as obstacles to be eliminated. Their story challenges us to consider the relationship between law and justice, between what is legal and what is right. The killing of Sovereign was legal in the sense that no one was prosecuted for it, that the official system treated it as a justified response to a perceived threat. But the killing was not just. Sovereign was a magnificent animal who posed no actual danger, who represented 150 years of family tradition, who was murdered by a man whose ignorance and fear were indulged rather than punished. The specific circumstances that produced the Boggs clan story, the combination of official overreach, the targeting of traditional communities for development, the contempt of modern authority for older ways of life, have not entirely disappeared. Similar conflicts continue to occur throughout rural America, continue to generate resentment that sometimes explodes into violence, continue to raise questions about who has the right to decide how people should live their lives. The descendants of the Boggs clan still live in those Crawford County hills, still breed horses as their ancestors did, still maintain the traditions that define their family identity. The bloodline that Sovereign represented continues through his offspring, horses that carry his genetics and that will pass them on to future generations. The family gathers regularly at the graves on the ridge, paying respects to the man and the horse, whose bond defined everything that followed. The hills of Crawford County remain today much as they were in 1973, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollow where Sovereign died still holds his descendants, horses that carry traces of his bloodline, that represent the continuation of a tradition that those 22 deputies could not destroy no matter how hard they tried. The land that developers wanted remains in Boggs' hands, passed from generation to generation as it has been passed for nearly 200 years. The story of the Boggs clan endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience. It is the story of heritage and what people will do to protect it. It is the story of ignorance and the damage it can do when combined with power. It is the story of family and the bonds that unite people against all who threaten them. It is the story of revenge and its aftermath, of the satisfaction that comes from balancing scales that the law refuses to balance. What about you, my friend? Would you make that journey to stand where Elijah stood, to see the graves where he and Sovereign rest together, to walk the hollow where a horse was killed and 22 men died in response? Would you breathe the hill country air, feel the wind that has blown through these ridges for millennia, sense the presence of history that lingers in certain places? The journey is not easy. The roads are narrow and winding, and the graves are difficult to find without a guide who knows the way. But those who make the effort say it is worth it, that standing in that place brings something into focus that cannot be captured in words or photographs. The drive from Indianapolis takes most of a day, winding through terrain that grows progressively more rugged as you approach Crawford County. The interstate gives way to state highways, and the state highways give way to county roads that seem to grow narrower with each passing mile. Modern GPS systems lose their signal in some of the deeper hollows, forcing travelers to rely on landmarks and local knowledge. The people who live in the surrounding hills still know the Boggs story, still speak of Elijah and Sovereign when strangers ask about the history of the region. They will point the way to the cemetery, will share their own memories, or the memories their parents passed down, will help visitors understand the context that makes the story comprehensible. They do not judge the Boggs clan for what they did, do not condemn them as murderers, see in their actions the response of a family that had been pushed beyond what anyone should be expected to endure. The Boggs family homestead remains occupied by descendants who continue the traditions their ancestors established. Visitors who approach respectfully are sometimes given tours of the property, shown the barn where Sovereign died, walked through pastures where his descendants still graze. The family does not speak of the campaign itself, maintains the silence that has protected them for decades, but their hospitality demonstrates that the Boggs tradition includes grace as well as ferocity. The gravesite sits on the ridge above the homestead, overlooking the land that the family has held for nearly 200 years. The stones that mark Elijah's and Sovereign's resting places stand side by side, man and horse together in death as they were in life. The view from the ridge encompasses miles of hill country, forests and fields that have known the Boggs family since before Indiana achieved statehood. Standing at those graves, looking out over the land that generations of Boggs men and women have worked and defended, one can almost feel the presence of those who rest there. They are gone, of course, have been gone for years now, but what passed between them remains, preserved in memory and song and story. The questions they force us to ask, about heritage and its defense, about what any family would do when their identity is attacked, have no easy answers. The hills keep their secrets, holding the memory of Elijah and Sovereign close like they hold the morning mist and the evening shadows. Their story will continue to be told as long as people remember what happened in Crawford County during that terrible year, as long as families defend their heritage with a ferocity that the modern world can barely comprehend, as long as systems fail and ordinary people find their own extraordinary ways to respond. They are gone now, dust mingling with the earth of the ridge where they lived and where they rest, but what happened between them echoes still through time and will continue to echo for generations yet to come. And that, my friend, is the true story of the Boggs clan, who butchered 22 deputies after one of them shot their prize stallion Sovereign. Each death delivered in a manner that echoed what had been done to the horse, the campaign continuing for exactly 1 year until every man responsible had paid with his life. A story of heritage and devastating loss, of patience and righteous fury, of justice found where the law would not provide it, and of a family who proved that some bonds, whether between humans or between humans and the animals they love, are sacred beyond what modern society can comprehend. The story speaks to questions that have no comfortable answers, questions about the nature of heritage and the limits of what any family should be expected to endure. The Boggs clan killed 22 men, staged each death to echo what had been done to Sovereign, committed acts that the law must condemn regardless of the circumstances that drove them. But they acted from a place of profound violation, from an attack on their identity that went far beyond the killing of a single animal. The hill communities that knew their story and protected them during their campaign understood something that the official world could not comprehend. They understood that Sovereign's death was an assault on values they all shared, that the stallion represented not just the Boggs family's heritage, but a way of life that all of them maintained against the pressures of a modernizing world. They understood that the clan's vengeance was not merely personal, but communal, a defense of traditions that everyone in the hills cherished. The federal and state authorities, who might have pursued the case more aggressively, eventually recognized the futility of their efforts. The Boggs clan had demonstrated that certain communities could not be subdued through ordinary means, that the isolation of the hills provided protection that even modern law enforcement could not penetrate. The decision to let the matter drop was pragmatic, the recognition that continued investigation would produce nothing except continued frustration. The descendants of the Boggs clan continue to breed horses in those Crawford County hills, continue to maintain the traditions that their ancestors established 5 generations ago. The bloodline that Sovereign represented survives in his offspring and their offspring, horses that carry his genetics into the 21st century. The family gathers regularly at the graves on the ridge, paying respects to the patriarch and the stallion whose bond defined everything that followed. The hill country of southern Indiana remains much as it was in 1973, ancient and patient and indifferent to human drama. The hollows that sheltered the Boggs clan during their campaign still shelter their descendants, people who know the history and who honor the memory. The modern world has encroached somewhat, brought paved roads and cell phone towers to places that once knew only horses and footpaths. But the essential character of the region remains unchanged, a story of a family who lost everything that mattered to them in a moment of ignorant cruelty, who refused to accept that loss as their final word, who proved through terrible means that they possessed the same capacity for vengeance as anyone who had ever worn a badge. The hills remember, and through them, through the songs and stories that continue to be sung and told across southern Indiana and beyond, so do we all, now and forever, as long as memory endures and people gather to hear tales of families who loved their heritage and defended it against all those who dared to destroy it.